Welcome to Unit 3, Art as Cultural Heritage, Lesson 17, Renaissance and Baroque Europe. The development of the printing press led to the spread of knowledge and a rebirth of the arts, literature, and science. In turn, a renewed interest in the classical ideals of the ancient Greeks led to a revival of naturalism and experimentation in art. This lesson looks at the artists from the Renaissance and Baroque Europe who contributed to our understanding of humanism and religious ideas in art through perspective, proportion, light, and motion. The objectives for this lesson are to explain the concept of humanism and its impact on Renaissance art and culture, contrast the techniques, media, and themes in Italian and Northern European art of the Renaissance, describe how social and religious events of the 17th century shaped Baroque art, compare stylistic characteristics of Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo art, recognize the relationship of Rococo art to the French aristocracy, discuss examples of art that function to persuade or influence the viewer. The topics we'll be covering in this lesson are the Renaissance in Italy, the High Renaissance, the Renaissance in Northern Europe, Late Renaissance in Italy, Baroque, and Rococo. The best way to start discussing the Renaissance is to define it. Renaissance means rebirth, referring to the rebirth of classical Greek and Roman culture. With the Renaissance, one must also understand the state of mind that was going on at the time during the Renaissance. Namely, humanism, which is a cultural and intellectual movement during the Renaissance, following the rediscovery of the art and literature of ancient Greece and Rome, a philosophy or attitude concerned with the interests, achievements, and capabilities of human beings rather than with the abstract concepts and problems of theology or science. The Renaissance didn't just happen overnight. There were many paths artistically that led to it. Here we have an example by Giotto di Bondone. It's the Lamentation from around 1305. One of the examples in here that we can look at is the representation of Jesus is not in hierarchical scale anymore. He's the same size as the other individuals in the painting. There's an attempt at realism, not that other painters weren't trying to do this, but artists started figuring out how to get light sources, add shadows, give their figures a sense of mass that really started transforming during the 1300s. The realistic look artists were trying to achieve in their paintings did go hand in hand with the thought process of humanism going on in the background, that even the representation of Jesus was in more earthly bound terms. We will now begin with the Renaissance in Italy. Hopefully some of you recognize this painting. We viewed it back in Lesson 2 dealing with space and linear perspective. This is the first painting based off of the linear perspective system. It's by Masaccio, titled The Holy Trinity. It's located at the Santa Maria Novella Church in Florence, Italy, from 1425. If you look at the measurements on the slide, it shows that it's almost 22 feet high by 10 feet wide. That's a little bit misleading in a sense, even though those are the accurate measurements. If you stand in front of this in person, everyone appears life-size. I've personally seen it before, and it definitely is extremely effective and nothing's oversized. But when you look at the measurements, it seems like it's huge. It's taking into account every single element that is in this painting. If you took a ruler and lined it up at the top with the little alcoves, little coffers that are in the arch above Jesus Christ on the cross, it would go all the way down to the base of the cross. That's how the linear perspective system works. Now beyond that, even with the accuracy of all the geometric and architectural aspects, the accuracy also in the representation of the fabric on the people in the painting is also quite an achievement. They also appear to have much more mass. This is a statue of David from David and Goliath. It's by Donatello from around 1425 to 1430. This statue of David was the first freestanding nude statue since ancient Roman times. Even though this is influenced by classical subjects, it does deviate from being over-idealized. Donatello tried to achieve some sense of realism in the posture that David is holding as well. Not necessarily that someone would be nude in battle, but the representation of the figure is more that of a boy. When we look at the other examples of David later on in this lesson, you'll see that there are many different ways that David was represented. I brought up wealthy patronage before. This statue of David was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici for his personal collection. David eventually becomes a metaphor for Florence, Italy itself, and we'll discuss that a little bit more when we go over Michelangelo's marble sculpture of David. This is a wooden sculpture by Donatello. It's of Mary Magdalene from around 1455. Donatello's intent was a humanist perspective on Mary Magdalene. It shows her at a much later age, haggard in appearance, meaning that she's lived a rough life, and also she's supposed to be in a stage of repentance. We could, of course, have a whole entire course on Donatello, but between the last two sculptures we've looked at, you can see the wide range of abilities from the Renaissance artist. This is a very famous painting. Most of you have probably seen this at one time or another before. It's by Sandro Botticelli, titled The Birth of Venus, from around 1480. This painting was the first large-scale mythological painting since ancient times. One of the reasons this painting falls in the revolutionary category is first that for 1,000 years most painters had been painting almost exclusively religious subject matter, and this is a representation of a pagan goddess at the center of a painting where normally Mary would be standing. We are now moving on to the High Renaissance, which was from around 1490 to 1530. With this next slide, I'm not trying to take away any of the seriousness of the Renaissance, but it could lead you to memorize your four main Renaissance artists in a very easy fashion. I didn't know how many people were actually familiar with that the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were all named after Renaissance artists: Donatello, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. I'm not sure how many of you have heard the term Renaissance man before, but it's referring to this individual, Leonardo da Vinci. You should be familiar with his name by now. We've covered him in a few previous lessons. Renaissance man refers to someone who can basically do anything, and da Vinci was one of those individuals. He was proficient in mathematics. He was highly interested in civil engineering inventions. This babe in the womb sketch out of one of his sketchbooks is not necessarily a preparatory drawing for a larger painting. It's a study of the human form in the womb. I'm not sure about this particular sketch, but this most likely was an observational drawing like some of his others, where he was allowed to sketch cadavers and their internal organs, as well as their bone structure, muscle structure, and the way the skin laid on top. There are many famous paintings, but this could perhaps be the most recognizable painting on Earth. It's by Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa, from between 1503 and 1506. With Da Vinci and actually some other Renaissance artists, gone are the hard outlines around the human figures. They're trying to represent things more accurately. We ourselves in real life do not have outlines around us. The effect that Da Vinci used was called sfumato. It's the soft blurring of edges. It's meant to look kind of smoky. The Mona Lisa herself in here has a lot of physical accuracy to her, but the background is much more of an atmospheric, dreamlike landscape. The Mona Lisa has been through quite a lot. It is now encased in a giant plastic enclosure, which is kind of irritating when you go to see it. But it's because back in 1911 she was stolen and she eventually was found again. And back in 1974 someone decided to spray paint on her. Religious subject matter did not disappear during the Renaissance. There were other subjects, of course, that they liked painting besides religious subject matter, but there's a good 1,000-year history of iconography and painting that's associated with that. So it was still common to use a lot of the same subjects. Luckily for us in this course, we only have to review one painting named The Last Supper, but there were not only single versions of that particular subject. There are many different Last Supper paintings. But Leonardo da Vinci's is most certainly the most famous one. If you look at the painting, this is a very accurate representation. It is a fresco that has faded over time, and eventually it will get worse unless some modern technique is come up with to preserve it even further from fading. Just like Masaccio's Holy Trinity, Jesus is at the center of the composition. If you remember some of the earlier things we were going over with composition, we talked about the triangle or pyramid composition. Jesus is certainly a part of that. He is the stable triangle at the center of this composition. The stable pyramid or triangle is used very successfully in this in more of a conceptual manner. Since it's used with Jesus Christ in the center, it's more of a philosophical view of who he was, that he was the stability, he was the center. If we look at the characters off to the left and the right, they're definitely more in active positions compared to Jesus, and we're going to discuss those in these next two slides. This slide is a breakdown of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper, showing perspective lines as both the organizing structure and the symbol of content. So try not to get confused by this. There are a few things going on here. If you look at the center of Jesus Christ's head, we've got a dot right there. That is our vanishing point. That's where all lines will recede to eventually in a perspective drawing. Now, there are a few other things going on in here, which is the stability of the triangle or the pyramid. If we look at the one going all the way to the bottom, it follows the base and forms the bottom of the triangle at the bottom of the painting. The other triangle is basically angled from the center of Jesus to the top of the table, and you can see how the design of the characters follow that line structure. But what may be confusing about this particular diagram is that triangle that's on the tabletop to the center of Jesus with the vanishing point is really not any of the perspective parts. It would completely incorrectly represent the perspective because there's actually a bottom floor that the table sits upon, and those lines are not represented necessarily because it's covered in the top portion. Renaissance artists were very conscious of the compositional elements within their paintings, as Leonardo da Vinci was in The Last Supper. It's very common in modern art. We also teach our students to be attentive to this, but you can credit the Renaissance artists and predecessors like Giotto for really emphasizing this and establishing this as a trend that would continue until modern art today. This diagram is just a breakdown of what I spoke of before, which is Christ being represented as a stable triangle, and the rest of the characters having much more activity to them. It adds an action to the painting, but it's also more of a philosophical sense, like I said before, that Christ is the stability, he's the anchor. This was not made by the artist himself. It is a portrait bust of Michelangelo Buonarroti from 1565. We will refer to him as Michelangelo. Michelangelo was the first superstar artist, so to say. He was very well known in his own time. There were many books published about him in his own time, including writings by himself. He was a poet, an architect, a sculptor, and a painter. Kind of a Renaissance man, just like Leonardo da Vinci, although focused on some different things. Michelangelo studied at the school in the Medici Gardens, which was from the Medici family. And for a good portion of his life, his major patron, the person who commissioned him to do a lot of work, was Lorenzo de' Medici. This slide is of Michelangelo's David. It was made between 1501 and 1504. David was of symbolic importance to the city of Florence. They saw themselves as David and saw Rome as a representation of Goliath. The Medici family also became a representation of Goliath. The Florentinians were fiercely independent and didn't want to necessarily be controlled by anybody. The Medici family eventually became so powerful that two of them were popes at one time. Michelangelo also gained his tutelage from the Medici family, and they were his major patrons for a good portion of his life. On the technical side of this sculpture, this was never really intended to be looked at from the angle we're seeing it. If you look closely, you'll notice the hands are enlarged, and the head is actually enlarged. Everything looks like it's physically accurate in one sense, but this was intended to be viewed from below. The enlarging of the hands and the head is to add some corrective optics so you could see the statue more correctly from below. This is not very different from what the ancient Greeks did when they built the Parthenon. This is the creation of Adam. It's one of the frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican in Rome. It was painted by Michelangelo between 1508 and 1512. The creation of Adam is one of 9 panels that are depicting scenes from the story of Genesis. This is on one side a traditional religious painting, but it's also a Renaissance humanist perspective that God is a decent man giving the gift of life to Adam. If you notice, they're both sized in the same dimensions. Makes God seem very earthly. This slide is almost a full view of all the frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. It took Michelangelo 4 years to make this. Many of those hours were spent laying on his back on scaffolding, painting by candlelight, long into the hours of the night. This painting is Paul preaching at Athens, made between 1515 and 1516, by Raffaello Sanzio, otherwise known as Raphael. Raphael was well known for using classical subject matter in his paintings. We also examined the School of Athens, which also deals with classical subject matter, back when we were going over linear perspective. In this painting as well, we have a lot of perspective going on. This time the vanishing point is not right in the center of the painting. This creates a very dynamic composition. Another interesting point about this painting, it's also in the sense of preservation, is that this is a watercolor. It has the vibrancy more of a tempera painting, but it's a very well preserved and vibrant watercolor painting. We're now moving away from the High Renaissance. We're going to go back a little in time and start with the Renaissance in Northern Europe. Jan van Eyck was a painter from Flanders. Flanders was where now portions of modern-day Belgium, France, and the Netherlands are. He was one of the early pioneers of oil painting. This is a work by him called the Arnolfini Portrait. It's from 1434. Van Eyck really showed the world what oil paint could achieve. There are a variety of different surfaces and textures in this painting. If you look on the back wall, it's textured with stains and bumps. Then you have the mirror in the center, which was much more highly reflective, as well as the chandelier. And then you have the different varieties of velvets and fabrics on the two individuals in the painting. as well as the fur of the dog and the wood grain on the floor. Some historians think that this is a record of a wedding, although no official records go along with this. There's a lot more to this painting than just an image of two people getting married. There's a lot of symbolic significance in some of the images painted in here. If you look at the top of the painting, there is a single candle lit, which is a representation of the presence of Christ. The dog is a symbol of marital fidelity. The bride holding up her skirt is symbolic of someone's willingness to bear children, and green is also symbolic of fertility. Although it's not very obvious, Van Eyck also painted a tiny portrait of himself in the mirror on the far back wall. Humanism's influence on Renaissance painting in Italy also spread northward to Europe, where painters started making paintings of scenes of everyday life and the common man. These paintings are known as genre paintings. This is an example of one. It's titled Hunters in the Snow from 1565 by Peter Bruegel. This may not look like your typical Renaissance painting from Italy, but it does owe a lot to the Renaissance in Italy. It has heavy use of atmospheric perspective, and it has an extremely complex composition where your eyes wander through the painting following all the buildings and the people at different locations and depths within the painting. There's about a 150-year time difference between the time this painting was made by the Limber brothers, which was in the 1400s, and the painting we just looked at by Peter Bruegel, which was made in 1565. Both paintings depict the subject matter of everyday life, but their similarities stop there. This painting still uses the Gothic tradition of a progression through time, whereas Hunters in the Snow is more of a snapshot in time. Hunters in the Snow also has atmospheric perspective, which fades off in the distance as atmospheric effects change the way we see things. There is nothing like that in here. There's extreme inaccuracies in the size relationships between objects in this painting. So the 150 years just shows how quickly painting matured in that time period in Europe. Our next topic is the late Renaissance in Italy. This is an example of late Renaissance architecture in Italy. It's from Andrea Palladio. It's the Villa Rotunda in Venice, Italy, made between 1567 and 1570. Palladio was the most influential architect of his time, and he, like other Renaissance artists, went back to classical times to seek inspiration for their work. This was directly inspired from the Roman Pantheon. It's considered a free reinterpretation of it. The main difference is it's not a public meeting place like the Pantheon was. It's a private residence for a nobleman. Here's an example of the Pantheon, and you can see how there is some overall influence, but there is not this giant opening that is the portico as before, and it does come off as being more of a residence. It's also considerably smaller. This painting by Paolo Veronese is one of the first examples of a trial against artistic freedom. Veronese was commissioned to do this painting. If you look closely at it, it does have similarities to the Last Supper, and that's originally what it was intended to be. It is now titled The Feast in the House of Levi. It was painted in 1573. Because Veronese took liberties with the subject matter and added so much else going on, even though Jesus is at the center of the painting, it's not necessarily the center of attention. You're immediately drawn to other figures due to colors and positioning, and there's a bigger piece of the story. He was charged with impiety, which is basically considered being undutiful to your religion. On another note, when you look at this painting, you can see heavy influence from the artist Raphael. If you think of the School of Athens, there's a big similarity between the way they are laid out. We are now moving away from the Renaissance and onto Baroque art. The period for Baroque art was between 1600 and 1770. It can be pretty easy to describe Baroque art with one word, and that would be dramatic. Gone is the reason and calm of Renaissance art. Baroque art focused much more on emotion and high drama. This painting is the Conversion of St. Paul, made between 1600 and 1601 by Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio. We will call him Caravaggio for short. Caravaggio was known for using a technique that was an evolution of the chiaroscuro technique. His technique was called tenebrism, which means dramatic light effects. Dramatic light effects, or tenebrism, is symbolic of a blinding flash of light that symbolizes a religious epiphany. This is the third and final sculpture of David we will be looking at. It's from 1623 by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. This is a fine example of what Baroque art is. It's full of drama, emotion, and it's much more of an energetic pose than the Davids that we looked at from Donatello and from Michelangelo. Another difference between this and Michelangelo's David is that this is life-size. Michelangelo's David was almost 14 feet tall. It was massive. We're now going to look at all three of the Davids together. If you notice, Donatello's on the left is the aftermath of the battle, a victorious David. The David by Michelangelo in the center is the contemplative David right before the battle, and Bernini's is right in mid-swing. Three completely different representations of the same subject. This sculpture is also by Bernini. It is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa. This is a detail of the altar, made between 1645 and 1652. This is also a life-size sculpture. This sculpture depicts one of the visions of St. Teresa and is done in the typical over-the-top Baroque style. You can really pick up on it mostly in the expression on St. Teresa's face and the incredible drapery that is on her body. The clothing almost has a life of its own. This painting is by Flemish painter Peter Paul Rubens. It is The Raising of the Cross from 1601 to 1611. This exemplifies the Baroque style. It is full of drama and emotion, down to the bodies that are pulling Christ on the cross, to the expression on his face. Rubens became heavily influenced by the art of Michelangelo and Caravaggio. He went down to Italy to study painting after he finished studying painting in Antwerp. There are opportunities abound for artists in the 1600s to make a pretty decent living for themselves. An artist could survive off of doing works for the church, for wealthy merchants, or for nobility. Artists who worked for nobility and made portraits were called court painters. One of those painters was Diego Velázquez de Silva. This painting is Las Meninas, or the Maids of Honor, from 1665.
Many artists started off as court painters and later became independent, but Velázquez felt very comfortable painting the court life and did that his whole entire career. The subjects in this painting are painted in a very realistic and unflattering way, which is an influence from the Renaissance. Velázquez painted himself in a humorous fashion into this painting. You can see him off to the left with a paintbrush in his hand. Some of the other characters in this painting are the king's daughter at the center of attention up front. In the back towards the doorway, you can see a courtier standing there being lit from behind. And if you look slightly to the left, there's a mirror right there with the reflection of the king and queen looking over their daughter as she is being painted. This painting by Rembrandt, Return of the Prodigal Son, from between 1668 and 1669, does owe a little bit to the Renaissance. It's got a slight bit of a humanistic perspective. This is a retelling of a Bible story. The story behind this painting is that of a son who has returned to his father and is fully accepted back after wasting his life and spending all his wealth on needless and useless things. Rembrandt stands out a lot from his counterparts because he was painting quite a bit differently than artists were at the time. He used a lot more loose brush strokes in his work, which is a Baroque trait in the sense that that's a characteristic of a emotional style of painting. Jan Vermeer is one of my favorite painters from this time period. This painting is The Kitchen Maid from around 1658. Vermeer was also known for some loose brushwork like Rembrandt. It just wasn't as extreme or emotional an approach as Rembrandt did. The paintings from Vermeer tend to be very calm and serene. This painting also follows in the tradition of other painters in Northern Europe, painting scenes of normal everyday life. The paintings by Vermeer tend to look like photographs from afar. It's when you walk up close to them and look at them that you pick up on the loose brushwork, but there is an extreme photographic quality to the color and shading that he uses, but he still seems to maintain this artistic sensibility where things are loose and not overly tight like most Baroque paintings. Baroque sensibilities could also be seen in the architecture of the time period. This is a painting of the palace at Versailles in France from around 1665 by Pierre Patel. This conversation is more about the palace itself than the painting of it. Versailles was basically a statement by Louis XIV that he could outdo anybody, any king before or after him in lavishness. Versailles sits on 15,000 acres and is located about 12 miles south of Paris. Versailles eventually becomes a symbol of the decadence and the pompous attitudes of the French aristocracy, and places like this would cause so much resentment that eventually the French people would revolt about 100 years later. One of the funnier stories I heard about Versailles was back when I was going to art school. We were going over the lavishness and decadence that sometimes came along with the French aristocracy and Baroque art, and even though the French aristocracy was looking down at the people and thought themselves as more sophisticated, there was one thing about Versailles, is that it smelled really bad during this time period. There were little moats outside of the little buildings that you see there where people would throw their raw sewage out of the windows. I always thought that was a little bit of irony there in the story of Versailles. Rococo is a lighter, more playful version of Baroque art. There's a lot of decoration and lavishness to it, but there's not as much. This is the Salon de la Princesse from the Hôtel de Soubise in Paris, which was begun in 1732, designed by Germain Buffon. This was a place to enjoy your surroundings, not to get lost into any heavy subject contained within the paintings. Everything has a light subject matter. This is a Rococo painting by Jean-Honoré Fragonard. It is titled Happy Accidents of the Swing from 1767. This falls very comfortably in the Rococo category of being light and fluffy and not very serious. When one looks back on this time period, you can see how the French people became increasingly upset with the aristocracy and the nobility, how they were living lavish lifestyles that seemed to be at the expense of the common people. This painting is also somewhat of an erotic painting. If you see, the woman on the swing is kicking her leg up, which basically exposes underneath her dress. She's also kicking her shoe off, the shoe revealing the ankle and the foot, which were considered erogenous zones, meaning that they were sexy at the time. There's also a man in the bushes able to see into her skirt, and curiously there's a man in the back that's encouraging all this by pulling the swing back and forth.
We are now at an end of our lesson on Renaissance and Baroque Europe. Thank you for listening.